The coat smelled of horse and wet wool, and it was 3 sizes too large, and Rosalind Vane pulled it closer across her shoulders and stood in the dark of the carriage arch at Renfield Hall while the frost came down on the cobbles, and the family she had served for 11 weeks discussed in the lit window above her precisely how they intended to be rid of her. She had taken the coat from the peg outside the tack room. It belonged to Tom Ferris, who was 14 years old and who slept above the horses, and who had left it there while he carried water. She had told herself she would return it before he missed it. She had told herself several things that night, and none of them were the truth. And the truth was that a woman in a governess's gray gown, standing under a lit window at 9:30, would be seen and named and dismissed within the hour, while a stable lad in a rough brown coat with the collar up was a piece of the yard's furniture, and no one looked at furniture. Above her the window stood open 2 inches for the smoke of the fire. Through it came the sound of a fan opening. Then the voice of the Dowager Lady Marchborn, a voice trained across 61 years to carry exactly as far as it wished to carry, and no further. "The girl is a convenience," she said. "Nothing more. We shall have her out before the 12th, and no one shall ask why." Rosalind did not move. The cold had found the gap at the coat's throat and was working its way down, and her hands inside the 2 long sleeves had gone numb at the fingertips, and she stood in the arch with her back to the stone and did not move at all. She had come to Renfield in October to teach a child who did not speak. What she did not yet know was that the reason the child did not speak was standing in that room, in a navy coat, saying nothing, with his hand at his breast pocket where a folded thing lived that he had not opened in 2 years. Stay with the arch a moment longer. What happened under that window would not be spoken of at Renfield for a generation, and the woman in the borrowed coat would be at the center of every telling of it. Now back to the frost. She had arrived on the 14th of October in a hired chaise that could not manage the last half-mile of the drive, and she had walked the rest of it with her box on her shoulder and her boots taking on water at the seams. She was 24 years old. Her father had been a country vicar with a good library and no living to leave, and when the fever took him in the spring, she had learned in the space of 1 afternoon in a solicitor's office that a good library is not a fortune, that a vicarage is not a house, and that a woman of 24 with Latin and Greek and no settlement is a problem the world solves by turning her into staff. The housekeeper who received her was Mrs. Odell, a broad, slow-moving woman with flour on her cuffs and a way of looking at a person's boots before her face. "You are the governess," Mrs. Odell said. "I am. You will find him quiet." Mrs. Odell did not say who. She turned and went up the back stair, and Rosalind followed her, and that was the whole of her welcome to Renfield Hall. The child was Nicholas. He was 7 years old. He had brown hair that would not lie flat, and a habit of standing with one shoulder slightly forward, as though a door were always about to open on his left. He looked at her when she came into the schoolroom. He did not speak. He had not spoken in 2 years. Mrs. Odell told her that evening, in the passage, quietly, with her hand on the wall. "Not since his mother." "Since his mother what?" Rosalind said. Mrs. Odell looked at her boots. "You will want the coal scuttle filled before you sleep," she said, and went. So the first thread Rosalind was given at Renfield was a sentence with its end cut off, and she carried it up to a cold room under the roof and lay awake with it, and it did not let her sleep. The father was Adrian, Earl of Renfield, and she met him on the 3rd morning in the long gallery, and he did not see her. That was not quite true. That was what she told herself. He came down the gallery from the West End with his boots loud on the boards and his coat still carrying the cold of the yard, and she stood aside against the paneling with Nicholas's hand in hers, and the Earl passed, and his eyes went across her and did not stop. He was perhaps 34. He was tall, and there was a stillness in him, even in motion, the way there is stillness in a stopped clock that still has all its works. He said nothing to his son. He said nothing to her. Then at the door, he stopped. He did not turn. He stood with his hand on the frame for the space of 3 breaths, and Rosalind watched his shoulders, and the shoulders did something she could not name. Then he went out. Nicholas's hand tightened in hers. "He is busy," she said to the boy, and she was ashamed of herself the moment she had said it, because it was the sort of thing adults say to children when they cannot bear the silence. And Nicholas had not asked her anything, and Nicholas would not. The dowager arrived on the 9th day. Lady Marchbourne was the late Countess's mother, which is to say she was Nicholas's grandmother, and no relation at all to the Earl, except through a daughter who was 2 years in the ground, and she came in a traveling carriage with a maid and a footman, and 4 trunks, and she took the blue rooms on the south front, as though they had been kept aired for her, which they had, because Mrs. Odell had been given her orders a week before. She was small and upright, and her hair was white and dressed high, and she wore gray silk and pearls the size of peas, and she held her fan a half-inch higher than the fan wanted to be held. Rosalind was presented to her in the morning room with Nicholas beside her. The dowager looked at Rosalind for slightly longer than was polite, and slightly less than was rude. "This is the girl. Miss Vane, my lady." "Yes." The fan moved once. "Well, he must have someone, I suppose, to mind him. A vicar's daughter." She said it the way one identifies a species of bird one has no particular interest in. The parish charity case. How very like Renfield to take on a charity case and call it a household. The words went into Rosalind and lodged somewhere below the sternum, and her face did not change, and her hand did not move on Nicholas's shoulder, and only her breath went out of her a little more slowly than it had gone out before. The parish charity case. She heard it in her own voice, all the way up the back stair. The dowager had come for a reason, and the reason arrived 4 days later in the person of Miss Cecily Danforth, who was 19, and gold-haired, and who had been told from the cradle that she was the correct choice, and had never yet been given cause to doubt it. She was the dowager's great-niece. She sang. She sat at the pianoforte in the yellow drawing-room after dinner, and sang 3 songs, and did not sing a 4th, because a 4th would have been eager, and Cecily was never eager. Rosalind heard the singing from the schoolroom above, through the boards, and she sat with Nicholas and a Latin primer while the notes came up through the floor, and Nicholas put his finger on the page and traced the shape of a word he could not say. Amare the word was. To love. She did not make anything of it. She turned the page. That was the 9th of November, and by the 10th, the household had understood the arrangement without a word being spoken. The dowager had brought a bride for the Earl of Renfield, and the Earl of Renfield had not said no, and a man who does not say no in the 2nd week is a man who will say yes in the 6th, and Mrs. Seggs. Odell had already begun to think about the linens. Rosalind understood it too. She told herself it was nothing to her. She was staff. She had a room under the roof, and £8 a year, and a boy who did not speak. And the marriages of earls happened in a country she had been shown out of at 24, in a solicitor's office. That was what she told herself. 2 nights later, she came down the back stair at 11 o'clock, with an empty scuttle, and found the Earl in the passage outside the schoolroom, standing in the dark, doing nothing at all. She stopped. He turned his head. There was 1 candle burning at the far end of the passage, and it did not reach him properly, and she saw his face in pieces. The line of the jaw, the darkness under the brow, the mouth. He had been standing outside his son's door in the dark. She could not think how long. "It is late," he said. His voice was low and entirely level. "Yes, my lord. The scuttle. Leave it. It will be cold by 5. "Leave it," he said, "and go to bed." She heard it as dismissal. She heard it as a man telling a servant to stop rattling ironware outside his son's room. She said, "Yes, my lord," and she went, and her face was hot the whole way up the stair. And she did not understand why her face was hot, and she lay in the dark and was angry at him, and under the anger where she did not look, her pulse was going like something running. He had told her to go to bed because her hands had been red to the wrist and it was 11 o'clock, and she had been up since 5. She did not know that. She would not know it for some time. What she knew was that the next morning there was a second scuttle in the schoolroom filled. That no one would admit to having brought. The dowager's second voicing came on the 15th, in the yellow drawing room, in front of 11 people. There was a dinner. Rosalind was not at the dinner, but Nicholas was to be brought down for a quarter of an hour before it, as the dowager had decreed, and so Rosalind stood at the drawing-room door, with the boy's hand in hers, and a room full of silk and candlelight in front of her, and Cecily Danforth in ice blue at the instrument, and the dowager seated in state by the fire with her fan at its half-inch. "Bring him in," the dowager said. Rosalind brought him in. Nicholas walked well. He had good manners and no words, and he stood where he was put and let a great-aunt turn his chin with one finger. "He is thin. He eats well, my lady." "He is thin," the dowager repeated, to the room rather than to her, "which is what comes of leaving a boy to the parish charity case, my dear Renfield." The fan turned toward the Earl, who stood at the window with a glass he had not drunk from. "You will want a proper mistress in this house before the boy is spoiled entirely. Cecily has been schooled for it since she was 9. The room did the thing rooms do." 11 people found something to look at. A gentleman named Mr. Havers examined the ceiling with great interest. Cecily's hands stayed on the keys, and her chin came up a half-inch, not in triumph, in something more careful than triumph. Rosalind stood with her hand on the boy's shoulder and looked at the fire-irons, and did not move. Her mouth said nothing. Her hand on Nicholas's shoulder had begun to shake, and Nicholas felt it, and Nicholas reached up and put his own hand over it and held it still. That was the first thing he had ever done for her. And the Earl of Renfield at the window set his glass down on the sill with a sound like a full stop. "Miss Vane," he said, "take him up level, cold, uninflected." She took him up. Behind her, she heard the dowager say something bright and general about the weather, and the room take it up gratefully, and the pianoforte begin again, and she went up the stair with her jaw set and her eyes stinging, and told herself, again on every step, that she was staff. Come sit with her a moment on that stair, in the dark, before she stands up. Then let her stand up. She has 11 weeks in this house, and only one of them matters. The witnessing scene happened on the 20th of November, and neither of them ever spoke of it. There was a cottage at the end of the lower drive, where the Ferris family lived, and Tom Ferris had a mother in it, who had been sick since Michaelmas. Rosalind knew this because Tom told her in the yard, apologizing for the state of his hands. She began going down after Nicholas was asleep. She read to Mrs. Ferris. It was not charity. She had nothing to give. She had a voice, and 2 hours, and she gave those. On the 20th she read for an hour by a tallow candle in a room that smelled of illness, and Mrs. Ferris slept before the end, and Rosalind stayed anyway, and finished the chapter to a sleeping woman because stopping in the middle seemed a cruelty, even to a person who could not hear it. The Earl of Renfield stood outside that cottage for the length of that chapter. She never saw him. He had come down the lower drive on foot, and seen the light, and stopped at the gate, and he stood in the cold with his hand at his breast pocket, and listened to a woman read to a dying servant's wife, in a house where no one would ever know she had done it. And then he walked back up the drive alone. He did not sleep that night. Nicholas began to change in the last week of November. It was small. He brought her things. A feather, a stone with a hole in it, the dried head of a cornflower, gone paper blue. He put them on the schoolroom table without ceremony, and went back to his letters, and Rosalind put each one on the windowsill in a row, and by the end of the week, there were 9. On the 2nd of December, he brought her a miniature. She knew what it was before she had it in her hand. It was oval, and the size of a plum, and the paint on it was good, and the woman in it had dark hair and a wide mouth and eyes that were laughing at the painter. There was a hairline crack across the varnish at the lower left. "Nicholas," she said, "where did you get this?" He looked at the floor. "Nicholas," he took her hand. He led her out of the schoolroom and down the passage, and stopped at a door she had never opened, and pushed it with his fingertips, and it swung. It was a small sitting room, and it had been shut. There were sheets over 2 chairs. There was a pianoforte against the far wall with the lid up, and a music book open on the stand, and a page of it was turned down at the corner, mid-piece, as though someone had been called away and meant to come back. There was dust on the keys, thick and even, except in one place near the middle, where it had been disturbed by small fingers, over and over in the same 4 notes. And on the wall over the instrument there was a nail, and a pale rectangle in the paper where a portrait had hung, and no portrait. Rosalind stood in the doorway with the miniature warm in her palm and understood, all at once and completely, that she had been living in a house that had buried a woman twice. Miss Vane. She turned. He was in the passage behind her. She had never seen his face like that. It was not anger. Now, she had prepared, in the half-second she had, for anger, and what was in his face instead was so much worse that she could not have named it, and she stood in the doorway of his dead wife's room, with his dead wife's face in her hand, and said nothing at all. Nicholas went and stood against his father's leg. That was what broke it. Not her, not the miniature. The boy going and standing against him. Her name was Eleanor, the Earl said. He said it to the pianoforte, not to her. She was ill for 9 days. On the 4th day I went to London, because there was a bill in committee, and I had given my word to speak on it, and she told me to go. His hand had come up to his breast pocket. It stopped there. She wrote to me on the 6th day. I received the letter on the 8th. I did not open it, because I was to travel that night, and I thought that I would read it in the carriage, where I would have the time to answer it properly. He stopped. The dust lay on the keys. She died on the 9th day. I have not opened it 2 years. Folded in a breast pocket, unread, across 2 years and every mile he had ridden and every room he had stood in, with his hand going up to it and stopping. Nicholas was in the room when they told me, he said. He has not spoken since. And then, because he had said the whole of it, and there was nothing left in him to hold the door with, he looked at her. You may go, Miss Vane. She did not go. She crossed the room and put the miniature on the pianoforte, on the closed part, where a thing is put down carefully rather than surrendered, and she said the crack is at the corner, it will not spread if it is kept out of the sun. It was the wrong thing to say. It was entirely the wrong thing to say. It was a remark about varnish in a room where a man had just set down 2 years of his life on the floor, between them. He made a sound. It was not a word. She thought afterward that it might have been the beginning of a laugh, drowned before it surfaced. Yes, he said, out of the sun. She went. At the door his voice came after her. Low. Rosalind! It was the first time. She stood with her hand on the frame and did not turn, and she understood exactly why he had not turned, that first morning in the gallery, and she went up the stair and sat on the edge of her bed in the cold, and put her face in her hands and did not weep because she was not, in the end, a woman who wept, and because the thing rising in her chest was not grief. It was hope, and hope was more dangerous than grief, and she knew it. And she sat with it anyway until the candle went out. The Dowager understood the situation on the 4th of December. It took her a single dinner. She watched the Earl of Renfield across a table of 30, and saw that he had asked twice in the course of one meal whether the schoolroom fire had been seen to. She observed that he did not look at the door when it opened. She noted with the precision of a woman who had been reading rooms since the last century that a man who does not look at the door is a man who knows already, who is not going to come through it. She set down her wine, and rearranged 61 years of certainty into a plan, and it took her less than a minute, because her plan was always the same plan, and it had never once failed. She would make it public, and she would make it his choice to end it in front of witnesses so that it could never be undone. The eviction came first. It came through Mr. Blader. Julian Kerr, who was the Dowager's man of business, and who was also, by a small and convenient accident of the late Countess's settlement, a trustee of the sums laid aside for Nicholas's education. Why? He arrived on the 8th, with papers in a case. The provision, he explained to Rosalind in the morning, room with the dowager present, was for a governess of suitable establishment. A vicar's orphan without settlement, references from a parish, no formal engagement in writing. The trustees could not in conscience continue the disbursement. She would be paid to the 12th. He was very sorry. He was not sorry. He was a man doing a thing that was legal. You will see, the dowager said, that it is nothing personal, Miss Vane. It is only that the parish charity case cannot be permitted to arrange the education of an earl's heir. Anyone would say the same. Mr. Kerr, be so good as to have a copy for his lordship. The third voicing. In a room with a witness. On paper, on the record. Rosalind stood up. She said, "Thank you, Mr. Kerr," and her voice was even, and she went out, and in the passage she put her hand flat on the wall and stood there until she could feel her feet again. She had 4 days. She did not tell the Earl. He was in London on the 9th and the 10th, and she could have written, and she did not write, because she had been shown out of a solicitor's office once already, and she knew what it meant when a woman with nothing appeals to a man with everything. It meant she was asking. And the moment she asked, whatever he had begun to feel for her would be a debt he was paying. And she would not do it. Not that. She had 4 days, and she was going to spend them teaching a boy his Latin, and then she was going to walk down the drive with her box on her shoulder. Then, on the 11th, she heard the dowager say she would have her out before the 12th, and no one would ask why. Which brings us back to the arch and the frost and the borrowed coat. She had not gone out to eavesdrop. That was the truth. She would tell him later, and he would believe it, because it was true. She had gone down to the tack room to return a book to Tom Ferris, and she had heard voices in the yard, and she had put the coat on because the yard was cold and hers was upstairs, and then the window above her had opened, and the fan had opened with it. "The girl is a convenience," the dowager said. "Nothing more. We shall have her out before the 12th, and no one shall ask why." Then Julian Kerr's voice. "Careful. His lordship may ask." "His lordship will not ask, because his lordship will be told what he has been protected from. There is a letter." Rosalind's hands closed inside the sleeves. "I have had it since the funeral," the dowager said. "Eleanor wrote to him on the 6th day, and it was brought to me with her things, and I did not send it on because I read it, and it was not a letter a man should have. She wrote to him about the boy. She wrote that if she did not live, he was not to shut the house up and turn Nicholas into a monument. She wrote that he was to marry again, and marry warm." The fan closed. Rosalind heard it close. "I have kept it 2 years for his own good. He has a letter of his own in his pocket that he cannot open, and he has never once asked whether there was another, and I shall put this one in his hand on the 12th, after the girl has gone, and he will read it, and he will understand that Eleanor herself wished him to make a suitable match. And Cecily will be standing at the instrument when he understands it, and that will be the end of the matter." Rosalind stood in the arch in a stable boy's coat and did not breathe. She had been sent away by a legal instrument, and she had accepted it, because that was the world, and she knew the world. This was not the world. This was a woman holding a dead mother's last words hostage for 2 years and calling it kindness, and a boy upstairs who had not spoken since the day of the telling, and a man who put his hand to his breast pocket 40 times a day and stopped. She could take it. It was in the blue rooms, in a house where she had a key to every schoolroom press, had a reason to be in every passage, and she had one night, and no one looked at a stable lad in a brown coat. She stood in the arch for a long time. Then she went in through the kitchen door, and up the back stair, and knocked on the door of the yellow drawing-room, where the family was at cards, in a governess's grey gown, with her own coat over her arm, in the light where everyone could see her. There were 9 people in the room: the dowager, Mr. Kerr, Cecily at the instrument, Mr. Havers and his wife, the Earl of Renfield by the fire, with a book he was not reading. "Miss Vane," the dowager said, "the schoolroom is upstairs." "Yes, my lady." Rosalind's voice came out steadier than she had any right to expect. "My lord, there is a letter from the late Countess, written on the 6th day of her illness, in her mother's keeping since the funeral. I heard Lady Marchbourne say so an hour ago under the tack-room window. I am telling you in this room rather than privately, because I am leaving on the 12th, and I did not wish it to be my word against hers in a passage." The room went absolutely still. Cecily's hands came off the keys. The Dowager's fan did not move. That was the thing Rosalind remembered ever afterward. The fan did not move at all, and it should have, and its stillness was the whole confession. "You were listening at a window," the Dowager said in a stable boy's coat. "I was. You are a servant, and a thief of privacy, and the parish charity case, and you have stood in this room and called the peeress of this realm a liar. I have said what I heard." "And who," the Dowager said, "in this house, in this county, in this kingdom, would take the word of a vicar's orphan in a borrowed coat over mine?" She turned to the fire as she said it. She turned to the fire because that was where the Earl of Renfield was standing, and because in 61 years the fire had never once failed to answer her. He had put the book down. He crossed the room. He did not cross it quickly. He crossed it the way a man crosses a room when the crossing is the whole of the argument. 3 strides, past Cecily. At the instrument, past Mr. Frox. Kerr, and his case of papers. And he stopped in front of Rosalind Vane in her grey gown with her own coat over her arm, and he did not touch her. And he turned and put himself at her shoulder, facing the room. Then he held out his hand to the Dowager, palm up. "The letter, madam, now." 9 people watched the Dowager's hand come up to her throat. "Renfield, you cannot possibly. I would take her word before yours in any room in England." 12 words. He did not raise his voice for them. He said them the way he said everything, level and low, and they went through that drawing-room like frost, through a crack in stone. Nobody moved. The fire spoke. Somewhere below, a door shut. The Dowager's mouth opened. What came out of it was not a sentence. It was the beginning of one, twice, and then the fan slid out of her fingers and struck the floor. And Cecily, 19 years old and schooled for this since she was 9, stood up from the instrument and looked at her great-aunt with an expression of dawning, appalled comprehension, and said, "Aunt, you had a letter from Eleanor. That was what did it, not the Earl. The girl." The Dowager sat down. It was not a graceful sitting. She sat as though the chair had been the only thing in the room still willing to hold her, and she said, in a voice suddenly and terribly ordinary, "She was my daughter. She was my wife." The Earl said, "The letter. It was in the blue rooms in a work-box under a tray of silks. Mr. Kerr fetched it, because Mr. Burse. Kerr was a man who could read a room, and knew precisely when a legal instrument had ceased to be worth defending, and he carried it back, and put it in the Earl's hand and stepped away without being asked, and afterward he was very careful to tell everyone he met that he had fetched it at once. The Earl of Renfield stood in the middle of his own drawing-room holding 2 letters. He took the second out of his breast pocket. It was worn nearly through at the folds, and the seal was long gone, and the paper had taken the shape of him. He held them both, one in each hand, and Rosalind watched his hands and saw them steady and understood that they had been going to be steady, and that this was what he had been, for 2 years, perfectly steady, and shut. "Rosalind," he said. "Yes." "Read them to me." She looked at him. He did not look away. So she took the letters, and she stood in the yellow drawing-room in a house that had been shut for 2 years, in front of 9 people, and the fire. And she opened. First, the one that had been in his pocket, because that one was his, and she read a dead woman's handwriting aloud in a clear voice that did not shake. It was not long. Eleanor had been very ill, and it was 4 lines. She wrote that she was not frightened. She wrote that he was not to blame himself for the bill or the committee or his word, because she had been the one to send him, and she would send him again. She wrote that Nicholas was to have music in the house, whatever else happened. She wrote, "Come home when you can, my love, and do not run the horses." The Earl of Renfield stood in his drawing room and put one hand over his eyes. Nobody in that room ever repeated what they saw, not Mr. Tram. Havers, who told the story for 30 years, and always stopped at that point, and said only that it had been a private thing. Not Cecily, who married a physician in the spring, and was by every account happy. Not even the servants. They were, most of them, better people than the hierarchy they were standing in. That was the part the Dowager had never once accounted for. Rosalind did not read the second letter aloud. She folded it, and put it into his free hand and said quietly, "This one is yours to read alone." He did read it alone, that night, in the small sitting room, with the sheets off the chairs, and in the morning he opened the lid of the pianoforte. The Dowager left on the 13th. There was no scene. She came down at 8, and her trunks went out, and she stopped in the hall where Rosalind was standing with Nicholas, and she looked at Rosalind for slightly longer than was polite. "I was wrong about the letter," she said. It was not an apology. It was the largest true sentence a woman of 61 who had been right about everything since 1794 was able to construct, and Rosalind, who had been raised by a man who spent his life listening to people fail to say things, recognized its cost exactly. "My lady," she said, and curtsied, and meant it. The Dowager looked at her grandson. Her hand came out and stopped an inch from his hair the way another hand in that house had stopped at a breast pocket for 2 years, and Rosalind thought that they were the same, these two, made of the same held-back thing, and that this was why she could not bear him. Then the Dowager went out to her carriage, and she wrote to Nicholas every month for the rest of her life, and the letters were dull and dutiful and full of the weather, and he kept every one. Rosalind did not leave on the 12th. She did not leave, because on the 12th, at 6 in the morning, the Earl of Renfield came to the schoolroom and found her lighting the fire herself, as she had every morning for 11 weeks, and stood in the doorway with the cold of the yard still on him. "Stop," he said. "Sit down." She sat down. Her hands were black to the second knuckle. He did not sit. He stood over her and looked at the row of things on the windowsill, the feather, and the stone with the hole in it, and the paper blue cornflower, and the 6 others, and he was silent for so long that she thought he had forgotten her. "I have not said any of it," he said at last. "I want to say it badly, and I do not know how, and I am aware that I have had 2 years of practice at not saying things, which is not the same as being unable. My lord, Adrian." He said it flatly, like a correction of Latin. "I stood at the Ferris Gate on the 20th of November for the whole of a chapter. You did not know. That is the entire point. Nobody would ever have known." She sat with her black hands in her lap. "I have wanted you in this house since the 3rd morning," he said, "and I have been a coward about it because I believed that wanting anything was how she died. And on the 11th you came into that room in a gray gown and told 9 people what I would not have had the courage to ask 1 person, and I understood that I had been mistaking stillness for fidelity for 2 years, and that Eleanor, who knew me better than anyone has ever known me, wrote 4 lines from her deathbed, and spent one of them telling me not to run the horses." He stopped. His hand went up, and did not go to the breast pocket, because the breast pocket was empty now. It went to the back of the chair beside her, and stopped there. "I am asking you to stay, not as a governess. I am asking badly." Rosalind sat in the schoolroom with the fire catching behind her, and her heart going like a thing running, and looked up at him. "Ask worse," she said, and the Earl of Renfield laughed. It was a short, rusty, astonished sound out before he could stop it, and he put his hand over his mouth as though he had said something improper, and Rosalind stood up out of the chair, and took his wrist and pulled the hand down. They were very close then. Neither of them moved. She could feel the cold of the yard still on his sleeve, and the warmth coming up off him underneath it, and she could hear him breathing, and she thought that she could step back now, and no harm done. Then his hand turned under hers, and his fingers came up and touched very lightly the inside of her wrist, where the skin is thin, and stopped there. He was not going to. She understood that. He was going to stand there with his fingers on her pulse until she told him what to do, because he had learned what came of taking things and not going back for them. "Adrian," she said. He kissed her. It was soft, and it was not brief, and it was full of promise, and it ended. Because a small person came into the schoolroom looking for his primer, and they stepped apart, and Nicholas looked at them both with great interest and no surprise whatsoever. They were married on the 2nd of March in the parish church at the bottom of the drive, quietly, with Mrs. Odell in the second pew, crying into a handkerchief she had brought for the purpose, and Tom Ferris holding the horses. And 11 people who had not been chosen for their consequence. Nicholas spoke on the 1st of February. It was a Tuesday. It was nothing. Rosalind had come into the small sitting room, which was not shut anymore, and had a fire in it every day, and Nicholas was at the pianoforte, picking out the 4 notes he had been picking out in the dust for 2 years, and he got to the end of them. And there was a 5th note, which he did not know, and he stopped. Rosalind sat down beside him on the bench and put her finger on the key. "That one," she said, and Nicholas said, "That one." Then he played it. She did not make a fuss. She did not call out or weep or run for his father, though all 3 were in her and rising. She sat on the bench beside a 7-year-old boy and said, "Yes," again from the top, and he played it from the top, and behind her in the doorway where he had been standing for some time. His father did not move at all. The music book was still open on the stand at the page that had been turned down at the corner mid-piece, 2 years before she turned it up. By Christmas of the following year, there was snow on Renfield and a fire in the small sitting room, and a portrait back on its nail over the pianoforte. A dark-haired woman with a wide mouth and eyes laughing at the painter, hung where the boy who was learning to play beneath it could look up and find her whenever he wished, and which nobody in that house ever remarked upon on the window-sill, in a row. There were 9 things a child had once given a woman in a gray gown, when he had no words to give her instead. And on the table by the chair where Rosalind sat in the evenings, out of the sun, lay a small oval miniature, with a hairline crack across the varnish at the lower left, and it had not spread. Thank you for staying until the end. If Rosalind's night in the arch stayed with you, leave a word below, and go gently